This lesson on 2 Samuel continues with the aftermath of the death of King Saul, then to David's adultery with Bathsheba and murder of her husband, to his falling out with his son Absolom, and finally his ill-advised census on Israel. That's pretty much the gist of 2 Samuel. But you can see here in chapter 1, Saul and his sons have already died in battle, and a runner brings the news to David, but he falsely claims to have put Saul out of his misery, which he thinks will win him favor. But David, who would not dare to kill Saul himself, is incensed that this foreigner would gladly do it, so the runner is immediately executed. This is a case when a lie was used to make someone appear more noble than they really were, so it's clearly sinful. We've gone over this many times about when God uses a cover story or tells someone to use one, or in some way seems to condone an untruth. And this is not one of those cases, because the motivation here was clearly to make the runner make himself look better. And he was not the one who killed Saul anyway, and so he was not necessarily trying to get out of something, he was trying to get into something, and so that was equally wrong, because his motives were not to correct anyone's or protect anyone's honor except his own. So then down to verse 17, and we see here that David is also, in addition to being a warrior, he's a musician and a poet, and he plays and sings this long lament for Saul and Jonathan, and this is where we see the familiar phrase, how the mighty have fallen. God would later describe David as a man after his own heart, and we see a glimpse of it here in that David does not gloat over the death of the one who tried to kill him on many occasions. And God himself said in Ezekiel 33:11 that he takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked. So finally, let's go down to chapter 2, and David is coronated king of at least part of Israel. This seems to take stages. Then we go down here to verse 8, and the troops that had been loyal to Saul were still a problem. Saul's bodyguard Abner had made one of Saul's sons king, so the armies of Israel, they were kind of somewhat referred to in these sections, that Saul's troops were the armies of Israel, and the others were called Judah. I don't know if this is kind of a backdating kind of a thing where, like for example, when Moses was writing, he would use terms common to his day for areas or people that were under different names before, and this may be going on here, but just to keep things straight, Israel is referring to those forces still loyal to Saul. So the two armies face off, and instead of having them all fight, they do as a lot of times ancient armies would do, is pick their champions, or in this case 12 soldiers from each army, to decide the battle. But it was a stalemate because they all 24 of them wound up dead. They killed each other. So down to verse 12. Whoops, went a little bit too far there. The rest of the armies, after all the 12, their 24 killed each other, they decide to go ahead and fight anyway. But David's forces overcome, those led by Abner, the forces of Saul's army of Israel, though Abner himself and a few others get away. And then chapter 3, as time passes, David's forces grow stronger and Abner's grow weaker. And then during that time, David also has a bunch of sons and some of whose names will come up later. And then down in verse 6, when Abner is falsely accused by the king he had chosen of sleeping with his father's concubine, Abner decides to defect to David's side. A lot of people today think nothing of slandering others, but there are consequences, because it's just as much a sin as any other. To destroy someone's honor out of spite or mere suspicion is no better than murder, yet we quickly jump to wild conclusions on the mere appearance of guilt without even bothering to ask the accused for their testimony. So here is a trusted right-hand man of the king, and he just up and accuses him of something ridiculous. And this is extremely insulting, and it's defamation of character. So now let's go down to verse 22, and we see there that all this temporary healing and unifying of armies is about to be ruptured. A soldier named Joab I think we've met him before, is sure that Abner had only come to spy out David's forces when Abner defected. So Joab secretly goes off to meet with Abner as this to bring a message, only to run him through with his sword. And the text adds in verse 27 that Joab was also avenging the blood of one of his brother that Abner had killed earlier. But when David hears about what Joab had done, he pronounces a curse on all Joab's descendants. And then down to chapter 4, as the saga continues, we find out that Jonathan had a son who was crippled due to a childhood injury, but the others in the house where the child had been living were murdered in their sleep by some of David's men. They, too, thought that they were bringing David good news, but they got the same appreciation as the one who claimed to kill Saul. So these were really brutal times, yet here we are in the age of grace, virtually murdering each other over the most trivial things. So we can't really point fingers. Then down to chapter 5. And after all that, David is finally acknowledged as king over all of Israel. But as we can see down here in verse 6, there were still cities to conquer, including Jerusalem. The fortress of Zion mentioned there was part of the city itself, and it became known as, the whole area, I think, as the city of David. So he's now firmly established with Jerusalem as his capital. And the king of Tyre, for whatever reason, they don't say much about that, sends him workers and material with which to build his palace. Of course, a palace shouldn't be empty, so David gets busy with more wives and concubines to give birth to more children. What could go wrong? We'll find out. Then in verse 17, now it's back to those arch enemies, the Philistines, and David is told by God to wait for the sound of marching in the trees to launch his attack. And God intervenes at certain times for certain reasons, not the least of which is to remind people that they can't take sole credit for their accomplishments. This should, but often doesn't, result in humility. And then down in chapter 6, David sets his sight on retrieving the Ark of the Covenant, but along the way someone touches the Ark to keep it from tipping over, so God strikes that person dead on the spot. Godly as David is, he's very distraught and wonders how anyone will ever be able to safeguard it, so he just leaves it there for the time being. But as it turns out in verse 12, the family on whose land the ark had been sitting was being very blessed because of it, so David is renewed in his quest to bring it to Jerusalem. And when it arrives, they all have this big party, but David dances with such manic energy that his wife Michal, who's watching from a window, despises him. It doesn't tell us why, but we can only assume that maybe she felt it was unbecoming of the king to do that. That's what we can glean from her response to him, which we can see starting in verse 20. Because when the party's over, David comes home and Michal scolds him for his public behavior, but he doesn't see any shame in what he did because of the reason for the celebration. And we don't have details about anything other than dancing like an ordinary person. I don't know. But from that day on, Michal had no more children. And there's a lesson here for us as well, that we should not impose our own tastes, personal tastes, and propriety on others as if we have authority over them. We get our standards from the Bible, not from our family traditions. But at the same time, if you're going to make a public spectacle of yourself, make sure you don't shame anyone else. Not that David was in this case, but just to make that point, that we can't use this as an excuse to just continually irritate other people and be insensitive. We see that in the writings of Paul on meat offered to idols and so forth, where he tells us that the better path is to be sensitive to other people and try not to deliberately irritate them. And then down in chapter 7, we meet the prophet during David's reign by the name of Nathan, and David wants to build a temple for the ark, but God tells him through Nathan that he has shed too much blood and the honor will go to his son. And then we're going to skip over more of this mopping up that David had to do and in establishing his reign. And we'll go down to verse 15, I think, here, and we see that we come to the establishment of his officials, his court, including a priest named Zadok. And that name will figure prominently in the millennial kingdom prophecy of Ezekiel after chapter 39 in Ezekiel, which is the time of the restored Davidic kingdom mentioned in Amos 9:11, which the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 quoted in reference to a yet future kingdom. So this is not fulfilled even in our day. So the section of Ezekiel after chapter 39 about the millennial Davidic kingdom has not yet come to pass. Now let's go down to chapter 9, and you may recall that the crippled son of Jonathan, whose name was Mephibosheth, this is where David takes this guy to his palace to live and take care of in honor of Saul's memory. So he's still not gloating over the death of Saul. And then down in chapter 10, when David extends the same honor to another person in the land of the Ammonites, they don't trust him. So they humiliate his messengers and send them back to David. And then the Ammonites muster an army because they expect David to retaliate, which he does, and more battles ensue. Then we come down to chapter 11, and it's in the time of these battles that we meet the famous Bathsheba, whom David sees bathing on her rooftop since he did not go out to battle this time. And it was by the advice of his other soldiers, the people around him, his court, that said, no, we can't risk you in battle, you stay here. And I'm confident that the commentaries will make Bathsheba out to be a seductress of some sort, but bathing on rooftops was not uncommon because no building but the king's palace would be high enough to see down there. And they usually had, and they had to, by Mosaic law, have an edge around the roof so people wouldn't fall off. So this edge would offer enough protection from the roof next door of a building of the same height. But the palace was taller, so that's what's going on here. And David, apparently with his multiple wives and concubines, just apparently wasn't satisfied. So this only proves that excuses offered for cheating spouses are just that, excuses. Some so-called Christian leaders actually blame an unfaithful husband on his wife for being boring or out of shape or unsubmissive or some other lame excuse. But Jesus said that it's our own eye or hand that causes us to sin. The sin is in the sinner, not in the tempter. Although the tempter will have to answer for their own sin for trying to get others to sin, that is also a sin in itself. But if you give in, that's not the tempter's fault. It's your fault. And God will deal with those who tempt, but he'll also deal with the ones who give in. So now David sends for her, and it turns out she's married to a man named Uriah the Hittite. And we won't see until chapter 23 that he was no ordinary soldier in David's army. But David isn't in a sensible mood at all, so he impregnates Bathsheba. And again, the commentators may condemn her for going along with this, and certainly the critics do, but what woman was going to defy the king in those days? The scriptures do not condemn her, but instead put all the blame on David. And not even David condemns her, and you can read that. I think it's Psalm 51, where he's lamenting the terrible things he did. And we haven't heard all of it yet. Down in verse 11, or verse 7, in chapter 11, her husband was at the battlefield during this time, of course, and so David concocts a lame attempt to get Uriah to think he's the baby's father. So he summons Uriah under the pretense of wanting a report on the military campaign, but he really expects Uriah to spend the night with his wife. But instead, Uriah spends it in the barracks because he is more honorable than David at this point, and in that he can't allow himself to relax and go home while his men are camped in the open field and at risk. So we can see down here in verse 12 that David keeps him there another night, and then he tries to get him drunk, but Uriah just won't violate his conscience. So David becomes enraged and sends word to his general Joab to put Uriah on the front lines and then withdraw and leave him alone near the enemy city wall where he will be killed. And this is David rationalizing that he's off the hook for murdering Uriah because he didn't do it himself. The enemy killed him. You know, that's like putting down a banana peel on the floor right around the corner where people are walking and then saying it wasn't your fault that they fell down. So he's trying to come up with this really lame cover story to soothe his own conscience, to cover it up and make it not his fault somehow, so he can take Uriah's wife and add her to his collection, which is basically all that's really going on here. He has too many already, but that wasn't enough for him. And then down in verse 19, this version of David's scheming we see has actually worked, but of course other men are killed as well because of it. So David has more than Uriah's blood on his hands at this point. And this chapter ends with a simple statement about God being upset, but we're about to find out just exactly how upset he is in chapter 12. So the prophet Nathan is sent to confront David, but he does so by telling him a crime story that David takes as an actual event. And David gives the proper verdict for the crime. But as we can see down here, starting in verse 7, Nathan shouts in his face, "You are the man." After continuing to ream David about his act of adultery, murder, and ingratitude to God, Nathan informs him that though he himself will not die for this, since he expressed deep regret, admitting that he sinned against God, violence will never leave his family. Furthermore, his wives and or concubines will be raped in front of him by his own son in broad daylight. In this way, David's concealed crimes will be on public display for the whole nation, and on top of all that, the baby he conceives with Bathsheba will die. Now, the critics scream about this apparent injustice against the baby, but it is David and Bathsheba who will suffer. The baby will be in paradise. Death is not the worst thing for the most innocent and the righteous, who are much better off in an afterlife. And of course, no supporter of abortion has any right to fault God for this. They often do. Do as I say, not as I do. These people have no regard for other people's lives, and I'm convinced a lot of people online who would gladly murder anyone who doesn't agree with them on one reason or another, or by, again, gossip or perceived guilt about something, and yet they say God shouldn't do this. Well, God is the one who creates life, as you can read in the book of Job, that we come from God and we go back to God. So God can do this, and we are hypocritical when we would do the same thing if we had the ability, and we would. So now down to verse 13. This is where David has admitted what he's done, and he keeps begging God to spare the baby, but God's decision is final. David fasts and prays for 7 days, but the baby dies, and the servants are afraid he'll do something desperate, because look at what he was doing while the baby was still alive. But to everyone's shock, he gets up, washes, worships God, and eats a meal. So they ask him why he's acting like this, because it makes no sense to them, and he explains that as long as the baby lived, there was a glimmer of hope that God might relent. But now there's no more reason to hope, so because the decision was final, so he has to move on. So then we can see down in verse 23 that he comforts Bathsheba, and in time they have another baby, Solomon. That Solomon. We'll hear more about him in Kings. This is Samuel, so we're not going to hear about that in this book. But meanwhile, a lot of other drama has to happen. And in this, the fact that God would still spare David himself and continue his dynasty, we see both the justice and the mercy of God, because David is going to suffer for what he did. But God keeps his promises. We've already learned that. And there's nothing anybody can do to stop him from keeping them, but we can make things a lot more difficult for ourselves along the way. And God honors the stolen wife, Bathsheba, by making her the mother of the next king in David's line. So now down to chapter 13. And after some more battles, the curse quickly becomes evident again. David's son Amnon has a half-sister named Tamar, because when you got that many wives and concubines, there's a lot of half-siblings. And Absolom, I got a little ahead of myself here. Amnon wants Tamar as a lover, okay? So it didn't matter if she was his half-sister, he didn't care. So his friend hatches a plot for Amnon to lure her to his bedroom, and then he rapes her. But down in verse 14 of chapter 13, as soon as he does this, he instantly flips from being madly in love with her to hating her. So he sends her away in humiliation, but her brother Absolom just tells her, it's just, they're there, it's nothing, he at least takes her into his home. But David hears about it and is at least angry, but he does nothing to Amnon either. But then, because sometimes this is, inaction can be just as bad, just as with Eli and his sons. But then Absalom begins to hate Amnon and waits for the opportune moment to murder him. The drama is just getting warmed up. And then we go down to verse 22. It takes 2 years, but Absalom manages to lure Amnon to a place where sheep are being sheared and the men get drunk afterwards. So he has his servants kill him at that point. Then we go down to verse 29. They all take off because they know David will be irate, but the message given to David is that Absalom killed all his brothers. So David is beside himself with grief until another person comes and refutes the false report. And then the sons return, except for Absalom, who had run away to another place and would stay there for 3 more years. But David would keep longing to see him, which will turn out to almost cost him the kingdom. So you can see all these twists and turns. This is just getting worse and worse by the minute. But on to chapter 14. And because Joab knows David wants to see Absalom, he does something no self-respecting Christian man would dream of: consult a wise woman. And again, I would confront the commentators and the likes of Josephus about their claims of women being unfit to give legal testimony. The Bible is replete with examples of why those people are wrong. And then down in verse 9, the wise woman tells a story for the same reason Nathan did, to get David's decision on principle before he knows who the story is really about. But this time David is catching on, and we'll see down here in verse 17 that he figures out who put her up to this. And even so, he grants Absalom's return to Jerusalem, but Absalom has to stay in his own house, and he doesn't see David. So they're in the same town, but that's as far as David will let it go at the time. And 2 years are going to pass in this situation. And then down to verse 25, we can see that the family drama is really just beginning. Absalom is a handsome man, it says, from head to toe, and he has unusually thick hair that he would only cut once a year. But his father still won't see him, and Joab won't relay any messages, so he decides to essentially throw a tantrum to get attention. He burns one of Joab's fields. Now Joab has to go talk to him, and Absalom asks why he was brought home if he can't see his father, so finally he's taken to see David. But we can see now in chapter 15 that in the meantime, Absalom has collected a loyal group of men to serve as his own bodyguard, and he starts what amounts to a political campaign by sweet-talking people at the city gate. So political ads. And like any politician, he sows discontent with the ruling party and makes promises he has no intention of keeping. So his handsomeness and his charismatic personality are being used to his great advantage to mount an insurrection. And then down in verse 6, we can see that this goes on for 4 years, and then he makes up a cover story to leave the area and begin an insurrection without arousing his father's suspicion. And not even Absalom's own men know what he's planning. But let's go down to verse 13, and David gets wind of what's really going on, so he and his men take off in fear, which seems really bizarre. I mean, he's the king, he's in power, but he takes off when he hears the news. But keep in mind that David loves Absalom, for one thing, too much to strike him down. So he probably runs away to avoid battle, and Absalom had played his hand shrewdly by winning the people's hearts before making his military move, and David surely recognized that the best strategy for the moment was to retreat. So Absalom is a shrewd strategist here, and David knows it, so he's not being a coward, he's just recognizing that he had been tricked. So, on the other hand, he makes the mistake of leaving behind 10 of his concubines to take care of the palace. Remember that curse from Nathan about his wives and concubines? He leaves 10 of them at the palace. So we can see down here in verse 21 that in this section we're told that the priests of Zadok had taken the ark with them as well, along with David and the rest fleeing. But David tells them to take it back to Jerusalem because he hopes to come back there himself someday, if God is still with him. So they go back to Jerusalem, and down by verse 29, a short time later, David hatches this plan to infiltrate Absalom's advisory group and steer them the wrong way. So he sends some of his own advisors to claim they were now siding with Absalom, and in the process, they would be able to report Absalom's plans to the priest of Zadok, who had returned to Jerusalem. So they've got this communication line set up, which is a good move on David's part. He's had spies basically there and a way to relay messages through the priest. So now we'll go down to chapter 16, verse 5. And there's this guy named Shimei. I don't know how to pronounce that. Shimei, we'll call him Shimei, okay? And so David's running, going to a certain place, and he comes across this Shimei guy who is part of Saul's extended family. And this guy just begins to hurl a continuous stream of insults and curses and rocks at David along the way. Though David's men want to kill him, David won't allow it because he realizes that this is part of God's curse on him. So then down to verse 14, chapter 16. Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, Absalom has been advised by a respected man named Ahithophel to unwittingly carry out part of the curse Nathan prophesied, to sleep with the concubines David left in the palace, in a tent up on the roof where everyone could see. So the motivation was to fan into flame the antagonism between Absalom and his father David, but this was God's curse coming to pass. Now after this, we go down to chapter 17. Ahithophel, the wise advisor that everybody on both sides had always looked up to, advises Absalom to allow him, Ahithophel, to go and chase after David to the point of exhaustion, then strike him down and take his men back to join Absalom's army. In other words, they don't want to kill David's men, they just want David. But David's planted advisor, named Hushai, suggests a different strategy, one that requires Absalom himself to go into battle. Obviously, he just wants Absalom out where he'll be vulnerable. But his advice is accepted, and the truly wise plan of Ahithophel is rejected, which was humiliating beyond description in that time and totally devastated for any trusted advisor. And this is all God working behind the scenes. And then down in verse 14, remember that communication line from Hushai to David? The infiltrators relay the message of Absalom's plans, but they're exposed and found out in the middle of it, and Absalom sends out men looking for the spies. Though they hide in a well on this one property, and the woman there covers them up. And once again, we see the use of a literal cover story to send the men off on a wild goose chase. So this is the good use of deception. And then down to verse 21, the infiltrators escape. And again, I can only assume that if the commentators are consistent, they will say that God really wanted the infiltrators to die because the woman shouldn't have hidden them or told a lie. That's how ridiculous it gets sometimes. But Ahithophel, meanwhile, the humiliated advisor, goes home and settles his estate and then commits suicide out of shame. People today underestimate the deep pain humiliation can cause even now, but God will hold to account anyone who assassinates a person's character. That's the lesson for us. And now we go down to chapter 18. We come to what is arguably the most painful episode in David's life. He intends to go out to do battle with Absalom's forces, but his soldiers wisely insist that he stay in the city because David is the only one Absalom cares about killing. Even so, he instructs his generals to treat Absalom gently, in spite of all he's done. He is his son, after all. And then down to verse 7, we see there that David's army soundly defeats Absalom's, though it says that the forest claims more life than the soldiers. Apparently a very dangerous place. But then as Absalom rides through the forest, his ultra-thick hair gets caught in some branches, and it leaves him dangling while the mule he was riding on just keeps going. So he's hanging in a tree by his hair. It says head, technically, but unless his head went through some branches and got caught, I can't imagine that. It's much more likely that his hair got caught in thick foliage. But despite David's orders, when Joab is told that Absalom is stuck in this tree, Joab goes over there and thrusts 3 spears into him and kills him, in spite of what David had said. So this is not going to go well. And then down in verse 15, the news of Absalom's death caused the army to break off pursuit, and the enemy soldiers run to their homes. But now we can see down in verse 28 that when the news finally reaches David, instead of celebrating his army's victory, he goes up to his room and weeps bitterly. But don't weep when your army wins, because it demoralizes the soldiers and makes them ashamed in victory. So Joab goes to David and lectures him about this behavior, that it can't go on just because of David's personal loss. If he doesn't pull himself together, he will have no loyal soldiers left by morning. So this is wise advice from Joab. And in his diatribe, Joab informs David also that he seems to love his enemies and hate his friends. This is another lesson for the Christian community, which is known for treating each other like worst enemies than the devil himself. Outrage that should be reserved for those who deliberately subvert the faith is spread far and wide against anyone holding an opinion not in line with our own or on disputable matters. And such attitudes have essentially dismembered the body of Christ into 1,000 pieces. Another excuse Christians make for loving God's enemies and hating his friends is that we fear chasing away what is believed to be a potential convert, but not everyone is. We have to recognize that. And they believe we're chasing them away if we dare to defend ourselves or our faith or show any kind of backbone or spine or indignation at the honor of God being besmirched. But not only is it untrue that we will chase people away by showing some loyalty to God, and while it's also not true that everyone's a seeker, the far greater sin is for Christians to devour each other in public in front of the enemies of God who laugh at how we do their work for them. The Christian community has a reputation of shooting its wounded. We cannibalize each other in front of unbelievers, which is a far greater sin than anything we think somebody did to deserve that. Now in verse 15 here in chapter 19, we see that David has returned to Jerusalem and a pretty much united Israel. But Shimei, that annoying pest that cursed David and threw rocks at him, realizes he's in deep trouble now. So he falls before David and grovels and begs for mercy, which somewhat not surprisingly for us if we know David at all, he grants. But we can go down to chapter 20. There's always some who don't like the way things turned out, so someone named Sheba decides to split the people of Israel from the people of Judah after some bickering between them. But then down to verse 9, to Joab, he had been expelled for killing Absolom, but he went after Sheba on his own. And we can see down in verse 15 that they catch up to him and the army of Israel, and they put up a siege ramp to break through the wall of the city where Israel's army was camped. And once again, we meet a wise woman who speaks to Joab and tries to get him to stop from destroying their city. And he tells her that his only goal is to find this rebel leader, and she promises to throw Sheba's head to him over the wall, which she does. And then Joab returns to Jerusalem to see David, so she had some clout there. And she saved her city from ruin. Now we go down to chapter 21. A famine strikes the land for 3 years, and David finds out from God that it's because of the remaining evil men who had been loyal to Saul. So he goes out to these Gibeonites to see what they want in reparations for what Saul had done, and all they ask is for David to hand over 7 of Saul's male descendants to be executed. Now down in verse 15, it's back to dealing with those infernal Philistines, and we're told of the deaths of some giants, one of which was the brother of Goliath, and another having 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. A lot of people seem to think that all giants had this feature, but this is the first time it's mentioned in Scripture. So not all of them have all the same features, just as not all the Nephilim were giants. And then chapter 22 is another song of David, so you can read through that if you want, and then we'll go down to chapter 23. And these are, you can see there on the title, David's final words, which are also poetic. And in verse 5, he speaks of the covenant God made with him to preserve his family dynasty. And again, we can refer to the covenants chart that I've showed before, and you can look at the chart of how that's a different covenant than the one for Moses necessarily. So then, as mentioned in, let's see, we'll go down to verse 8 here. We mentioned earlier in the account of Bathsheba and her murdered husband Uriah, we see the list of David's warriors all having achieved extraordinary feats in battle, and Uriah is listed there as was mentioned before. So we're going to go down, I think Uriah is at the end there, yeah, verse 39, Uriah the Hittite, who was one of these noteworthy soldiers. And then chapter 24, we're not just quite finished with David's lapses of judgment just yet. And again, we wonder why such faults would be recorded if the scriptures were Jewish fiction. Why would they record things like this of one of their principal heroes? I mean, David is one of the highest respected name, if not the highest, along with Moses and Abraham. And here he is being, all his dirty laundry aired for the generations. Who would do that if they were making this up? They wouldn't. They would whitewash. So David orders a census of the number of available soldiers in Israel, though Joab can't imagine why it's needed. I mean, look at how God's been with them before, not knowing exactly how many they had for troops or whatever. And then down in verse 10, David feels remorse for this and asks God's forgiveness, but God tells him to pick his poison from three choices. Number 1 is 7 years of famine. Number 2, 3 months of persecution from enemies. And number 3, 3 days of plague in the land. He chooses door number 3 because he's tired of enemies. And the plague takes the lives of 70,000 men. So much for the census. But only then does David offer to exchange his life for the people, since they were innocent. Might have wanted to think of that a little sooner. But after a little more business there with constructing an altar and so forth, we can see this is the end of 2 Samuel, so we'll have to wait for the study on Kings to read the circumstances of David's death. And his family still has some drama to play out. We're just never done with that. So that's our study of 2 Samuel, and we'll pick it up again on the study of Kings.